we're building a legacy, and that's how we see the Archaeology Podcast Network. We don't look at each episode as some revolutionary thing. We see it as adding to a body of work that'll be around, hopefully, long after we're all gone.
This podcast encourages and empowers you to create your own unique real story, develop your own unique real statement, and discover your own unique real self. The power is yours. Good afternoon, Chris Webster. Previously, episode 1688 of the 12-Minute Convos podcast. It's been just 2 years, 2 months, 18 hours, and 15 minutes, plus or minus a few, since we last recorded that conversation. That was then, this is now. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's such a good, great opportunity to reconnect. Really having a ton of fun with these conversations. Of course, as the archaeologist, I believe you would understand my intrigue with curiosity. How have things evolved on your side? What's going on at arcpodnet.com? It's a tongue twister, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Well, on December 1st, 2019, we hit 5 years of running the network, and
congratulations.
Thousands of people interviewed. We're up to, across the network, we're a niche podcast. So, we have a dedicated audience, but not a massive audience. We get about 40,000 downloads across the network per month,
Wow.
Which isn't too bad for, a bunch of shows that, again, are very niche topics. And this month, we actually just hired, in January of 2020, we just hired our first advertising manager. So she's helping us take it to the next level.
That's amazing. How does it feel? I mean, looking back from not 19 podcast, how much are you up to? I mean, when we last spoke, you said 19, and I remember my foot quivered, my left foot quivered. Like, how does he do that? Is it still that number that you're pumping up?
Well, it's actually about 12 active shows right now, and we have a bunch in the archives. So we had a lot of hosts when we first started that were graduate students or, doing other things. So they would produce a podcast for 1 or 2 years while they had the time. And then as they moved on to other things, we just, dropped it into our back catalog. And that's kind of what we focus on at the APN, is really being an encyclopedia for archaeology, having this resource that people can go to. And it might not be current shows, but it's always archaeology. And archaeology doesn't really go out of style or go out of date. It's history. So you can find a show from 4 years ago, and it's still relevant to you today. So shows come and go, and we encourage that. And we like to try to bring in new stuff, but it's just fluid, and sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less.
It changes the dynamics of the focus of the podcast, doesn't it? That you're archiving as opposed to monetizing, if you would. Like, this is the monetizing, la, la, la. But I resonate with that. I want to archive the voices of humanity. I love how you said the encyclopedia for archaeology. I love that. That's wonderful. So how does it feel like when you look back? It's been just 2 years, right?
Yeah.
You've done it. Like, you've gone into this, and the years have passed, and you're still doing it. How does it feel?
It feels pretty good. I've actually changed a lot myself in the last 2 years, because around that time, I want to say it was probably about 2 years ago in the fall, I was in, I think, the second class of Chris Curran's podcast engineering school. And I just wanted to hone my skills as an editor and pick up those things that I hadn't picked up along the way, and, just fill in the gaps of my natural training that I had done for the past 6 years before that. And building on that training, I was able to really tighten up the editing on the Archaeology Podcast Network. But then right shortly after that, I also started Chris Webster Productions, where I now teach a monthly introductory class into podcasting, which I have tonight here in Reno. And I've got a monthly workshop that's a 9-hour workshop, in-person workshop on starting your own podcast. I've got that on Saturday as we're speaking today in January.
That's amazing.
So I'm teaching people how to podcast. I'm helping people put their podcasts out. I'm doing full engineering and production for clients in addition to the Archaeology Podcast Network. And I love it. I really love podcasting and what it can do.
Where did your ear develop? I mean, I understand the mind aspect. I understand the eyes aspect of what you do in archaeology, but never the listening part, right? Because things are usually dead, right? So where did that evolve from?
I don't know. I was always a podcast listener, and there were no podcasts about what I wanted to hear about the type of archaeology that we did. So as a podcast listener, and I found out quickly that a lot of archaeologists were not podcast listeners for one reason or another. And we've acted to change that in the past 5 years. And in fact, my first podcast, I actually started 3 years before I started the Archaeology Podcast Network. So the past 8 years or so, 8 or 9 years, I've been bringing archaeologists into this audio format because we're ideally suited for it. The professionals are for listening to podcasts while we're working, because we're always out in the desert and doing things and walking around, and just it's a conducive to an online audio environment. So then we found a worldwide audience with that mindset. So
I think I know what it is. Tell me if it's accurate. You are able to listen to your voice, the voice that says, hey, like it could be here, right? Or let's go read. Like there is a voice that this type of discernment, right? Curiosity at the same time. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. I think it really is. Yeah. And I just enjoy it.
That's wonderful. It's wonderful. Now, you are married still, right? So
yes,
how has that been affected, your marriage, in the midst of everything that you're doing?
I think it's great. In fact, my wife and I have I've been able to work remotely because I do other things, including, the other stuff that I've already mentioned. But most of what I'm doing, I'm able to do just from a computer and an internet connection. And my wife has not had that benefit. And I think she's been watching me be relatively successful at doing this and managing my time and managing to get all these things done, but while having the freedom to just do it whenever I want to do it, and not overwork myself, but have the systems and processes in place to get all these things done. And along those lines, she actually gave notice at her job last week as we're recording this. Yeah, and she's going to focus on her own design work. She's a knitter, and she wants to focus on her own knitting design work that she's been doing for the last few years. Wow. She just hadn't been able to put the time to it. So I think I've been a positive influence on that. And once she's fully remote, well, that opens us up for all kinds of possibilities.
Yeah. Get out of Nevada, right? Like
that's right.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
In the midst of everything, it seems as though, and you are probably one guy that interacts with this, which is the possibility of death, which could happen today or tomorrow. Is it in the forefront or the back end of your mind when you are planning?
I'll tell you what, it's interesting you say that. It's always on the forefront of my mind. I'm 44. I'll be 45 in April. And I had a sister-in-law pass away from cancer at 33. I had a good friend in archaeology pass away from cancer at 34. And I was just working with a client back in North Carolina. It's a big team, about 14 people. And I asked where this one person is that I've been talking with for the past 4 months as part of the team. I hadn't actually met them. I went back to finally meet them and do some training. And they said she was vacationing down in El Salvador, where I think she was from. And she always suffered from migraines, but she's 43 years old and just had an aneurysm and passed away right there, just with no warning. And I always think about that. I'm like, listen, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it now, and I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to do it with a mind to keeping it going, not hold all this information into myself. Like with the Archaeology Podcast Network, sure, we have one employee now, but I have about 15 volunteers from around the world helping us work on social media, marketing. We can't afford to pay them, but they understand and appreciate our mission and our passion for doing this. And I hope someday that I can compensate them that way. But right now, they're following along in this journey, and I'm passing on all that knowledge. I mean, I'm doing all the editing right now, but I have all the systems in place for if something were to happen to me, the APN would continue. So I'm constantly thinking about the longevity of it like that.
And there's a ton of value, right? Like I had one person on the podcast, and they recently said, I shelved my podcast because I'm not monetizing from that, and I need to focus on that. And I understand that. However, I believe the podcast has been given an unfair weight, if you would, to carry in that, hey, this is the thing you get in to monetize. I believe there's so many other benefits that go with it from a perspective of life value and life principles that come through the ability to listen. Would you say that's accurate as well?
I would. And I also would say that, anybody who is looking to try to monetize their podcast, if that's their goal from the get-go, then you have to look at the podcast like any other business. And to be honest, the more resources you put into it from a marketing standpoint, and then of course editing and production, you have to make it sound good from the first off, but the more resources you put into it, the faster it's going to grow. The more you treat it like a business, the faster it's going to grow. But that being said, if you don't want to put those resources into it and you're going to do this, from a volunteer standpoint in your off time and just keep it going with the thought that, hey, if I build this body of work, maybe I can monetize someday. I mean, that's kind of where we're at with the APN. We are, again, 5 years in on this network, and we've made some money, very little here and there, nothing very consistent, but we finally think we've reached the point where we have not only the listeners, but the platforms. We've got a new hosting platform that we're using that allows us to do dynamic advertising. And now we've got all these systems in place that we're thinking, this is why I finally hired somebody to professionally do this for us for the advertising. Is I think we finally reached that. And that's 5 years, 5 years of doing that. It didn't happen overnight. We had to build this following and build this group of people that want to hear us. And now I think we can offer this.
Yeah, well done, my friend. I believe too many times we go in this with a microwave mentality, right? To just pop that in for 30 seconds and we'll be good. But congratulations. It is such a grand opportunity to hear that you've not given up. Loved your podcast. I remember listening in preparation way back, and my son, I said, he has to be put on to this. I didn't follow through, but guess what? I'll definitely get it done. My systems have improved now, right? But yeah, get it done. I do appreciate you. And I do say thanks for your service to humanity, because this is what this is amongst the podcast world. It is a service to humanity that I think the next generation is going to look back and say, wow, that's what they were doing with their life force, right? But they'll have something, they'll have that archive. So thank you for that. In closing, is there anything else you'd like to share with our amazing audience?
Well, I would just like to echo what you said in that we're building a legacy, and that's how we see the Archaeology Podcast Network. We don't look at each episode as some revolutionary thing. We see it as adding to a body of work that'll be around, hopefully, long after we're all gone. And it's something we can look back on, be proud of, but also pass on to the next generation, because this information doesn't really change. It's archaeological, it's history, and now it's there and it's out in a different format for different people to access. And that's really the goal here. So
amazing audience. Again, Chris Webster. Chris, a pleasure. I treasure. Thank you for being on What is Inspired by 12-Minute Convos with Angel Jones. This podcast is produced by PodEdits. Visit podedits.com for professional podcast publishing.